here. Welcome to the afternoon panel of the 2026 Baker Peace Conference. My name is Cameron Dunbar. I'll be serving as the moderator for this panel. At this morning's panel, if you couldn't be with us, our speakers focused on the current state of American power at home, domestically. At least they sort of did. This afternoon, we're going to be widening that lens to look at the state of American power abroad and the ways that the United States influence in the world is evolving and changing. We're going to have 4 speakers, as you can see on this panel. They're going to speak for approximately 15 to 20 minutes each, and then we should have plenty of time at the end for question and answer. So we'll get right into it. Our first speaker, Ludovic Hood, is a career U.S. Foreign Service officer with 2 decades of experience working in Middle Eastern and European affairs. He was most recently the Chief of Staff and Counselor to the Special Presidential Envoy for Russia and Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. From 2021 to 2024, he served as the Senior Advisor to the Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. Prior to that, he served at U.S. embassies in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Paris, held several positions at the State Department in Washington, D.C., including working at the White House for 2 years as the Middle Eastern Advisor to Vice Presidents Harris and Pence. Before joining the State Department in 2006, he worked for the United Nations for 5 years in East Timor and New York, in addition to 5 years in the private sector. Mr. Hood's articles have been published in academic journals and newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, and he has taught a graduate seminar at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. He earned his BA from Brown University and an MA from Columbia University. Ludovic?
All of that means is that I've been a mid-level bureaucrat for the past 25 years. I don't know why Professor Holcomb and his team felt the need to puff it up like that. First of all, I know my co-panelists and I are stunned that you are all here on a Friday afternoon in spring at 3 o'clock. Seriously, what are you doing here?
Yeah, cheers to you guys.
We've all lost bets on how many students would show up. As Andrew noted, I'm still in the government, but I'm calling myself a soon-to-retire Foreign Service officer. I've hit 20 years. That's when a lot of us exit, move on to a new chapter. But I'm still on the payroll, and in theory, I should be sticking to certain talking points and press guidance given to me by colleagues at the State Department. Instead, I'm putting that to the side because I'm here in a personal capacity. And I want to bring my 25 years of practitioner experience, to the floor, to you guys today, ideally, particularly in the Q&A session, to sort of give you a practitioner's perspective, having, particularly on the Middle East, having lived over there for the bulk of my diplomatic career. So I'm going to keep these remarks shorter than 15 minutes with the goal of hopefully the undergrads and grad students here throwing a lot of questions, particularly about the Middle East. Because as you all know, we are 6 weeks into a conflict/standoff that in terms of foreign policy issues or crises I've covered, I've never seen such politicization in terms of media coverage, the instant reactions, the instant judgment, the narratives that erupted in the first hours about was this the right thing to do, wrong thing to do, who's in the wrong, who's in the right. There's been so much on your guys' social media feeds, I'm sure, not to mention the front page of major newspapers. That's probably a bit confounding, and I'm hoping we can actually go back 5 years, 10 years, even 50 years on some of these issues, particularly vis-a-vis Iran and the US. I think it might be useful just to rehash a little bit of the biographical information, not because I'm a pompous egotist, but because almost all my assignments have had a significant Iran nexus. And I probably didn't realize at the time when they first sent me to Kuwait for those of you who remember the original Iraq War, when David Petraeus led the surge and Kuwait was the entry point for hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And that's a lot of what we were doing in the embassy, even as a fairly junior diplomat like me. But of course, at that point in time, Iran was very active on the battlefield in Kuwait, and a lot of the injuries, US servicemen and women who were killed or maimed, a lot of that was on account of what Iran and its proxies were doing, in the context of the battlefield during the long Iraq War. I was then went straight to Bahrain after that, and again, these are two countries that have been, extensively bombed by Iran over the past 5-6 weeks. I think much to their shock and horror, because each of these small Gulf countries thought they had understandings with the regime in Tehran, particularly the Qataris, for example, and the Omanis. I think they thought they were, untouchable because of all the compromises they made. But we can unpack that a little bit later. After that, I spent some time in Washington. I worked on the Levant, Syria, and Lebanon. I worked on the Syrian civil war. Putting it crassly, it was, as many of you know, close to 500,000 innocent Syrians died in that civil war. And I was one of many hundreds of policymakers in the system in Washington, D.C., wondering what could be done to sort of stench that blood flow. Like what things could the U.S. and allies and others do that? And of course, the U.S. in the end took very little action, and it was the most horrific civil war or conflict experience that I had to live through. And it's sort of when my own feelings about my job sort of peaked at that point in time, because I felt in 2016 we could have been doing things in a very light touch the way that could have sent a signal to the Assad regime to stop massacring its people with Hezbollah's help and with Russia's help. I then did some time working directly on Iran, including during the Obama administration's efforts to get an Iran nuclear deal in place. And part of that was working at our embassy in Paris, because the French were a key partner on that. And then I spent 3 years in Qatar. So 3 Gulf assignments. I've spent close to 10 years in that part of the world that's been on your news feeds for the last 5-6 weeks. That's 3 out of the 6 GCC countries, was home for me, my wife, my 2 daughters. Extremely safe countries. I mean, I up until 6 weeks ago, I joked that my safest places I'd lived for me and my young daughters was these countries on Iran's doorstep. Of course, in the last 6 weeks, that all those assumptions that I'd taken for granted, but knew was frail, all came undone. As Andrew noted, I spent some time in the White House for close to 2 years, working in the first Trump administration, briefly in the beginning of the Biden administration. I did some time working for a wonderful academic at Emory University called Deborah Lipstadt, one of the foremost Holocaust scholars. She was picked by Joe Biden to be the anti-Semitism envoy. I got selected to be sort of her right-hand guy, and really enjoyed that work, mainly because we did a lot of good stuff in the Middle East. And we put together a trip to Saudi Arabia that was pretty much groundbreaking and historical. The reception that she got and the way the Saudi media covered it back in 2023 was incredibly groundbreaking by Saudi standards for literally thousands of years. And that leads me to where I sort of want to begin going into a little bit more depth. It was that summer where I want to sort of start the current situation, sitrep as we call it, about where we are today. We had this trip to Saudi Arabia. I will never forget going into the Deputy Foreign Minister's office, and he said, "Welcome, Ambassador Lipstadt. I'm from the city of Jews." He's from Mecca, and he was acknowledging, the pre-Islamic, Jewish presence up and down the Hijaz of Eastern Saudi Arabia up until the 8th or 9th century. And again, if you think about the fact that the Saudi state, through both textbooks or through particularly through proselytizing by Saudi-funded imams, had been the main exporter of extremist ideologies around the world, as far away as Indonesia, Bangladesh, even some U.S. mosques. The things had come a long way under the new young crown prince. 6 weeks later, I was in a building in New York called Turkey House. I was sitting in a room 3 people away from Turkish President Erdogan. Huge conference table, American Jewish community leaders, some Israelis, and he took questions for 2.5 hours. The day before, Bibi Netanyahu had been in the same room with him for the whole afternoon. Think about it, Netanyahu and Erdogan. Anyone who knows anything about the region, they'd had a really promising meeting. This was September 2023. And that summer, And the Biden administration had embraced the Abraham Accords. Biden more or less reluctantly went to Riyadh. There was talk about the Abraham Accords expanding, Arab countries normalizing their relations with the state of Israel, regional integration, talk of economic prosperity, cross-pollination, all the stuff that for me for 20 years, has just been so missing in the Middle East as I've lived there and covered it. And then of course, October 7th happened, 2023. And Israel experienced a spat of violence that, proportionately was for them akin to 15 to 29 11s. Now, I realize now, for me, it's easy, having actually been in New York on 9/11, to sort of hold up 9/11 as something huge. I know many of you were born after it or were still kids then, but this country was deeply scarred by what happened on September 11th. For Israel, imagine 20 times as worse, and pretty much every Israeli knew someone who had been killed. So this deeply traumatic experience, and then rockets started being fired in from Lebanon as well. Israel responded, and then we had this horrific war in Gaza. More relevantly for my talk, this actually unleashed a wider regional war that came in fits and starts. You may remember that in the summer of 2024, when Biden was still president, Iran fired a volley of ballistic missiles at Israeli cities after Israel killed a Hamas commander in Tehran. The Houthis, Hezbollah, for over 2 years were firing rockets and drones daily into Israeli cities. Israel was responding. And then, of course, last summer we had the 12-day war in June, Israel versus Iran. We got involved at the very end. But my point is, in some ways, the war right now, or the standoff, and by the way, there was some surprisingly good news in the newspapers today, which Carrie, Henry, and I were trying to unpack. We don't know what it means that the Iranians are declaring the Strait of Hormuz open, and Trump says things are resolved. We'll see what comes out in the next few days. But it seems tentatively promising. But my point is, in some ways, you need to think about this current conflict, no matter how it began on February 28th, no matter how certain media outlets may be portraying this current conflict's genesis as a continuation of the post-October 7th, regional conflicts, which themselves, in some ways, were the taking off of the gloves of a more discreet or clandestine contest between Israel and Iran, or between Iran and some of its Gulf neighbors. And of course, and sort of this may be a more trite, obvious point, but in some ways, what's happening right now is a continuation of 47 years of very painful, unfortunate American-Iranian history, dating back to the hostage crisis, which itself was another traumatic experience for America. I've got a freshman daughter myself at Tufts who's writing about the malaise in the Carter years, and a lot of that came to a head in that final year of the Carter administration because of the hostage crisis, because of the same, revolutionary Islamic regime in Tehran, and of course cost Carter the election that year, arguably. In some, don't tease me, guys, but I got to do this. As I said, the current war, and particularly the wars fought in the last 2-3 years, which I do think you need to put on some kind of continuum, particularly vis-a-vis Israel, the Sunni Arabs, and Iran, stem from Iran's, some will call it a sort of a hegemonic aspiration, if you want to go in a more theoretical term, but as some of you will know, over a number of years, Iran built up a presence largely through paramilitary proxies, some of which had a political movement on them, most famously in Lebanon with Hezbollah. Later in Syria, through their own intervention in the Syrian civil war, they were able to get a foothold there, and Iran was behind the importation of a number of different kinds of militias, even Pakistani Shia militias from as far away as South Asia. Yemen in the last 10 years has been through another horrific civil war. I never worked directly on that, but have many colleagues who did, and found that as upsetting to watch and to behold as I did on the Syrian civil war. But the Houthis, which 10, 12 years ago were really a ragtag, group of rural-based insurgents, now control most of the country, and thanks to Iran, have ballistic missile capabilities and advanced drone capabilities. But the point is, the Iranians have built up this Shia crescent that, even more than Israel, arguably, the Sunni world, particularly the Sunni Gulf monarchies, felt existentially threatened by. And given the US's own partnerships, with many of these Gulf countries, which aren't just strategic or military, but also, deeply entrenched through trade, investment, and energy, we kept getting sucked into. And this goes to I don't know if my title was shared necessarily, but the title I was going to go with, or which was approved before the conflict began, was, America in the world, from regional hegemon to strategic backstop ? And I was going to argue that, there seemed to be some optimism back in January after what Israel did to defang the Shia crescent last year, that we were moving in a better direction, and that maybe the U.S. could finally start the pivot that particularly the Obama and Biden presidencies had desperately sought to do, finally get us out of the Middle East, focusing on the perceived threat or competition with the People's Republic of China. But I was also planning to say, no, I think we're going to stay there for a while. I think things are going to flare up with Iran, and unfortunately, here we are in yet another period of dire conflict for the peoples of the Middle East. American power in the region, I believe, is here to stay. I think we're going to stay entrenched in the region and will be the most powerful external actor for at least the next few years. The Russians had their little moment in Syria, and to a lesser extent Libya. The Chinese have always surprised me with not being yes, there are some high levels of trade, but the Chinese have actually surprised me. They haven't done a better job of finding common cause with the Gulf leaders, for example. Strategically, the preference is very much with the United States. And I think particularly now, even if you believe the view, and there may be validity here, that some Gulf leaders are deeply unhappy with the Trump administration for causing this war, which unleashed serious harm on their oil and gas infrastructure. Even if hypothetically XYZ country is mad at us, they're still probably going to want to be closer to us than they were even 6 weeks ago, because the Iranians proved that they are an existential threat, and they are willing to inflict existential economic harm on countries, to include Qatar, that the country I know best, frankly, from my last assignment, that had bent over backwards to be a friend to everyone and really thought they had an understanding with the regime in Tehran. And they took a beating, and Ras Laffan, is their economic lifeline, this huge industrial city, and it could take 3 to 5 years to get that fully up and running, which obviously has huge implications, particularly for consumers in India and China and other parts of Asia. So just, before we go to Q&A after my 3 distinguished panelists go, I would just argue that American power is going to remain a defining influence factor in the Middle East, in large part because of our relationships with the Gulf countries. Some will say it's because of a so-called Jewish lobby or Israel lobby. I just, from where I sit, that's nonsense. Number one, if you know the Jewish community in America like I do, they are hopelessly divided, as is Israeli society, with extremely different views about what needs to be done about the Middle East and support for Israel. Number two, it's our relationships with, I think, those Gulf countries, and what is, despite current headlines, there's been a bipartisan preoccupation with Iran for decades, going back to what Carter suffered through. Don't forget, in the Obama years, the number one foreign policy initiative that had the most Oval Office attention was the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, it showed that they recognized that, somehow dealing with the Iran problem set, what was the key to somehow, hopefully bringing some stability to the region. We can debate the pros and cons of that particular deal, and my own view is that it actually only, in some ways, emboldened the Iranians to double down on what they were doing in the broader region, and to dramatically increase them, intense military support for Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, and others. But I'm friends with many of the guys who put it together. They felt that they could bring Iran into the fold somehow and deal with this perennial challenge in a purely diplomatic fashion, which for us diplomats makes sense. But you've also got to take a real cold-eyed realist view about what are the second-order effects and who's going to cheat and what are they going to do on the side. So I'll leave it at that. I'm not an expert like the four people this morning and my co-panelists. I'm a practitioner, as I said, a mid-level bureaucrat, trying to just share perspectives based on my own time in the field and really look forward to the questions. And finally, I don't know Eric well, but I want to just quickly extol my other two panelists who I do know from the DC scene. Henry is an extraordinarily accomplished diplomat, now retired. He'll tell you about his time, particularly in East Asia. But he worked very closely with two larger-than-life U.S. diplomats in recent years, Toria Nuland and Jim Jeffrey, and he was at their side. And they're considered two of the best, diplomats in the Europe and Middle East spaces together. And Henry was at their side for a lot of that. So you're very lucky to hear from him. And then Carrie Filipetti runs a small think tank, which she'll tell you about, the Vandenberg Coalition. I urge you all to follow her on social media. I'm old and boring, so I do it on LinkedIn. She'll tell you how else to follow her. But she is
also only on LinkedIn.
she and her team and the coalition are sort of in a unique position on the center-right think tank political continuum now, and a lot of us really admire what she's doing. Sometimes, waving a flag by herself. But please look up the Vandenberg Coalition and seek out their work.
Just let it be known, my middle name is Andrew, and my first name is Cameron. But if you keep to 20 minutes, you can call me whatever you want. So our next speaker, as you just heard, is Henry Haggard. Currently is the principal of Seekonk LLC. He's a senior advisor at West Exec Advisors. He is a non-resident fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Center for Energy Studies. And he is also a senior associate researcher with the KFBUB Korea Chair at the Center for Security, Diplomacy, and Strategy in Brussels, Belgium. In 2024, he completed a 25-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, retiring as a member of the Senior Foreign Service with the rank of counselor. From 2021 to 2023, he served as the top advisor on Korean politics and managed our bilateral security relationship at the U.S. Embassy in South Korea. Prior to that, he served as director at the National Security Council under both the Trump and Biden administrations, coordinating United States policy engagement with Turkey and the United Kingdom. He most recently served as the director for energy diplomacy, responsible for our energy policy toward Asia and the Middle East, where he built U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral energy cooperation in furtherance of the Camp David Summit goals. He received a BA in International Relations from Brown University and a Master's of Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College.
Thank you. Thanks, Cameron. And you have to forgive him. It's not his first language,
okay.
The whole English, So thanks a lot to our good friend, Professor Holcomb, for the invite. And thanks. This has been a great couple days of interesting conversations, and really glad I was able to visit a class yesterday and have the chance to talk to you all today and attend this morning. So what I'm going to do is pick up on some of the themes that Ludo talked about. We're to try to tell you also from the practitioner's perspective, but what I see as the U.S. role and the transformation of that role in East Asia. I'll focus, and where I'll start is when I was working for in the Trump National Security Council, with just underneath Ludo's office, I was covering Turkey and the UK. And in the National Security Council, in order to do anything, it was what our job is, I think at the White House, is to bring policy decisions up through the interagency to a point where at a certain level there's a decision made to do X or Y or Z. It could be very mundane, or it could be a matter of war and peace and great import. But ultimately, our job as a director is to take issues and bring them up. And to bring them up, this idea of it just means a series of meetings with successively more higher ranked people. You bring in the assistant secretaries from defense and CIA and everywhere, and then you bring the undersecretaries from defense and CIA and everywhere, and then you bring ultimately either a decision is made or you keep going up to principals level and potentially a signature from the president or even a meeting with the president. So the reason I give this story is, so I was covering Turkey, and the UK, European countries. The currency of a director is to, can you move a policy up toward decision? I mean, I think that's your job. You coordinate and get differing views together. You show that you're valued by taking these diverse views across the interagency and bringing them up to decision. When I was working there, again, I say Turkey, UK, European countries, the way I could convene a meeting, which was, you needed to convene a meeting, and then the next meeting was, if I said, I want to do a meeting on Turkey, a meeting on UK, rooms are full, rooms are booked, people are busy, how about next week, how about next month? If I said Turkey and China, the UK and China, didn't matter, I just add China at the end, and the next day you had a meeting, and the next day you had a meeting, and off you go. And so this was as clear as day that this was how foreign policy was made. It was made through the lens of China policy. And it was good experience, worked on Europe/China, and again, Turkey/China. Then the Biden administration came in, and I continued on as the career officers do, and the China-focused policy continued. There was essentially no change in the focus, in the importance, of China as, again, obviously there are discrete issues that had their own impetus to decision making and policy making, but certainly in the Europe Directorate, we were still focusing on and building on China as the real lodestone or lodestar for how we convened policymakers and built to policy decisions. And so this was interesting to me as working on Europe, and then I went out to the one change, the one difference, which I'll come to later on, was the value of alliance. As I moved in, as the new team moved in, I stayed. The new team moved in. The push was, again, same policy lines, same policy objectives, arguably, with the change being that there was a renewed emphasis on the value of alliance and alliances. And so in this case, as I left the White House, this was, even while I was there, who were the first meetings? The Japanese, the Koreans, alliances, important alliances that had been, the relations were not necessarily problematic, but they had the value of the alliance in the Trump administration had been less important than the specific policy objective. And again, we can argue whether that's a good focus or not, but just to say that the policy objectives remained. The change I saw was in how we looked at alliances and how we saw what value we placed on, again, I'm talking about Korea specifically as we go forward through my talk, how we valued the alliance with South Korea, and not to find ways to accommodate South Korea, but how we could utilize the relationship with South Korea to advance U.S. interests. I think that's one. I think when you have a very discrete look at, is this, are we, the United States, going to get more or less money from South Korea, more or fewer troops to Iraq, Afghanistan, whichever request you're making to an ally, in this case South Korea, that's a very yes or no, up or down, it's qualitative. Is it good? Is it bad? And I think when you're looking at a policy, and this goes to our posture abroad, I think there's two different ways to look at each of those decisions. They're looking at what is the value to the United States in that alliance. Again, irrespective of how many troops are provided, how many meetings are attended, how much money is allocated to a particular, global fund or whatever the particular issue might be. So as I left, seeing the policy continuity in the new team, I went out to South Korea and served there for a couple of years, working on rebuilding. Well, the alliance remained strong. There was a lot of doubt by the U.S. administration about the South Korean administration because there was perception that they South Korea, were hedging their bets between us and China. And so again, it was when you're looking at our alliances and looking at our posture in East Asia, again, seen through the China lens. And I thought one of my main tasks was to explain the value of the alliance and explain why there was value to the United States working with Korea and Japan on initiatives around semiconductors or trade or military cooperation or deterrence of North Korea, whichever the issue might be, that was separate from, and I believe was at least helped explain what South Korea's posture was towards vis-a-vis China. And right now, so I'll get back to how I see Korea's view of China, but as I moved out of the State Department and now I'm looking at Korea issues mostly as a consultant and think tanker, I see that we now have two presidents, President Trump and President Lee in South Korea, that also have a very less traditional view of the value of alliance. As I explained, I think the difference between the Trump administration and Biden's administration, what I saw, their value of alliance. We also have a president coming in South Korea who, up until his election, had traveled to the United States once as mayor, 15 years ago, had traveled almost maybe regionally, but I'm actually not certain that he went really anywhere. He is the consummate retail politician, lawyer, that fought his way up tooth and nail, mayor, governor, and now president. So there is not an automatic value assigned to the alliance by either of the presidents that we have that are now in office. And so there's an opportunity there for that to allow for greater flexibility in an evolution of the relationship. And what I mean by that is most Americans who look at South Korea policy and the alliance, and most also South Koreans who look at the alliance, they see this as once an ally, always an ally, fought the war together, have troops in Korea, and this is kind of the way that things go. What Trump has been able to do is both he offered South Korea nuclear submarines in a deal in the fall. This is something that was, again, part of the understood view of South Korea from all policymakers over the decades, that South Korea, nuclear submarines were for Australia, for the UK, for various reasons, for our closest allies, if any. So now there's a deal to offer South Korea the capacity and capability to build nuclear submarines, which could change the alliance and make it less about deterrence of North Korea and more about regional posture. So this is the flexibility of President Trump to see South Korea as the potential of it as a regional player. I think offers some possibility of it certainly will change the alliance, but it comes from not coming in with a preconceived notion of the value of the alliance. And I think we'll see this becoming more regional. We also have a very dollars and cents approach to the alliance. We have the South Koreans agreeing to buy $25 billion of U.S. defense articles, which is, we've maybe heard in the press or seen the investment by Samsung and other Hyundai, other big Korean companies investing in the United States. Korea is also buying. They're the number one importer of liquid natural gas from the United States. They're and now with this defense acquisition plan, we'll be one of the largest purchasers of our equipment. So there's a change as Korea becomes, in theory, more of a regional partner, and it's all, I think, under the China lens and the lens of investment. I think that the issue about with Korea is they have, and the reason why I think just on the China piece I'll come back to, Korea has already made its decision. All its chips are with us. All of it in the early 2000s, you saw Korean investment go to China, all the IP taken. They had another wave of investment in the late 2000s, early 2010s, with the next higher tech screens and other things, ships to an extent. Tech was stolen, IP was stolen, and now you see a jealous guarding of the Korea's technological advantage over China in the chip industry, and a determination to not lose out. I look at it as a third wave, certainly in the last 30 years, of kind of big investments and loss of IP from China in South Korea. So now the big investments are in Texas and Indiana and Alabama and Tennessee from South Korea, and the factories, the lower tech factories, are moving from China to Southeast Asia. So the issue, this is great for the United States in the sense that South Korea has put its bet on us. The issue is if our administration does not necessarily see the value in the alliance to begin with, if this administration sees, again, the Iran conflict, whether there was an understanding of the potential for the closure of the straits or not, there almost certainly was not a discussion with Japan, Korea, our treaty allies, about how this could affect them. So what you see as a result, again, back to flexibility of leadership, because it does come down to leadership in this, particularly in this case. Now the Korean president is making comments that you would never see from a Korean president normally about Israel, about other issues that are not anti-American, but I could see him trying to chart a more independent foreign policy view, which ultimately is not in the U.S. interest, but the Korean leadership and some in Korea may start to see that they have to hedge their bets because of, to diversify their energy supply, to have more closer ties to China economically and otherwise. So I think that next, so that's kind of how our approach to alliance and some of our policy views that maybe don't, again, my view, don't take into the value of alliance as much as they could or should. So that is, to me, I think, a missed opportunity, because ultimately it's about how the U.S. develops its China approach, which is to me, the way we will compete successfully with China is with and through our allies. If you look at something like nuclear power, over the next 25 years, the IEA suggests that there will be a doubling of nuclear power capacity. That's roughly a couple $1 trillion over the next 25 years. The United States would like to have some of that market. The only way that I think they will be able to compete effectively with China is with Korea and Japan, who have the technology, the supply chain, the construction capability, et cetera. These are the geopolitical alliances, whether even if not traditional military alliances, that will allow a China policy to be effective, in my view. So this is where we're at. I think one of the silver linings of this administration's, in my view, undervaluing of alliance, full stop, whether it's with Korea or otherwise, is that now you have a much better relationship between Japan and South Korea than you would have otherwise. This is also helped by China's and Japan having some conflict, pushing Korea and Japan together. But this is, I think you will have, again, now I'm an diplomat by training, an optimist generally. What you can see and what should happen, and again, the best case scenario is you have these Japan-Korea improving relations, Japan-Korea-Taiwan on economic supply chain issues, more coordination with more minilateral and plurilateral groupings, whether it's on chips or overseas development aid or other issues that are perhaps getting less attention from this administration, then they could have realized that there is a leadership that they can take vis-a-vis the United States, but also vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific. South Korea and Japan could take more ownership and leadership in South China Sea, in their relations with Taiwan as well. So I think I'll kind of wrap it up there, but what I want to talk about is the importance of the view of China. And I think, and just to go back to the start of this, it was the Trump administration that built a bipartisan view of the danger of China. It built a bipartisan view, really the direction that our China policy is essentially on since that time. I think to make that effective, and I think, is to use our alliances effectively to complement the clarity that there is, in more or less, in China policy, but having the value attached to alliances, and particularly the case with South Korea. I think it's clear that there's value to the United States, so it's about valuing that alliance and seeing how you can leverage that in order to accomplish greater strategic goals.
All right, our third speaker, Carrie Filipetti, is the executive director at the Washington, D.C. think tank, the Vandenberg Coalition, where she leads efforts to advance a strong and bipartisan United States foreign policy rooted in national security and democratic values. She is also a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center. Prior to these roles, she served in senior roles in the U.S. Department of State, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cuba and Venezuela in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, and as Deputy Special Representative for Venezuela. She also served as Senior Advisor to the Havana Incidents Task Force from 2019 to 2020, coordinating an interagency response to the unexplained health incidents affecting U.S. personnel and helping identify long-term care solutions. Earlier in her government career, she was a senior policy advisor at the U.S. mission to the United Nations, where she advised Ambassador Nikki Haley on counterterrorism, Middle Eastern policy, and Western Hemisphere affairs. Carrie holds a degree in religious studies from the University of Virginia, where she was both a Jefferson Scholar and an Eccles Scholar.
Thank you. Well, I'm really excited to be here, and Ludo, thank you so much for the nice words about the Vandenberg Coalition. The one thing that I'll say up front is one of the goals, the Vandenberg Coalition has sort of two purposes. One is to articulate an updated foreign policy for today's threat environment, which borrows from our namesake, Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who really helped craft what you might consider the sort of conservative internationalist vision that accompanies but is very distinct from the sort of Wilsonian liberal internationalism, and would love to dive deeper into that for those of you, especially who were here in the earlier talk about the development of the sort of liberal international order. But the second goal that we have is to really help bring talented young people into the foreign policy environment. And so I really highly encourage, for those of you who are here, you're obviously interested in foreign policy, please do feel free to reach out to me. I am unfortunately only on LinkedIn. I'm a total Luddite. I hate social media. You can find me there, but you can also email me. I'm just Carrie at vandenbergcoalition.org. We also offer paid internships, so just a slight, small request that you consider looking into that. So what I'm going to talk about today, because most of my government experience was dealing with Venezuela, which happens to be a key topic, or at least was a couple months ago and is quickly becoming less of a key topic, I want to focus a little bit on Venezuela, but knowing that you all are not necessarily hyper-motivated by Venezuela or Latin America, I'm going to use our policy currently towards Venezuela as a lens through which we can try to understand some of these broader shifts in American foreign policy. And before I start, I do want to have two caveats. So the first is, and this is something that I always try to start with, understanding something is not the same necessarily as supporting it or agreeing with it. And oftentimes when I explain where the policy is going, people will say, she's endorsing this, she's endorsing that. Some of it I love, some of it I'm not so keen on, but I think especially as students, understanding something It doesn't mean that you agree with it, and in fact, it might give you more fodder to disagree with it effectively. So I encourage you to really try to understand if somebody says something that you're like, boy, do I disagree with that. It's really helpful to try to understand where it's coming from. So I'm going to try to do a little bit of that explanation. Obviously, I am not in the administration, and President Trump can be kind of notoriously difficult to pin down strategically, but I will explain sort of what I perceive. The second thing is, as I'm talking, I will share some perceptions on how I think these shifts in foreign policy help or hurt America. And I think here it's important to have an understanding of what do I mean when I say help or hurt America. And this too is something that people always kind of assume what people are trying to achieve. In the context of China, there's often this narrative in sort of hawkish conservative policy circles, we got to beat China, we got to beat China. And the amount of times that I've asked these folks, okay, beat China, what does that mean? What does that look like? What do you mean when you say beat China? And so here, my answer of what is help or hurt America is that America is two things. Yes, it's our borders, our country, our citizenship, all of that. It is also an idea. It is our Constitution. It is our founding values. And so I'm not saying that the entire purpose of our foreign policy is exclusively to pursue freedom and democracy and to defend it abroad. But what I am saying is in the pursuit of our foreign policy, we should make sure that we are still staying true to those principles, because otherwise we might have Americans, but we won't have America as we understand it. And I think the goal of our foreign policy should be to try to do both of those things and not sacrifice one for the other. So that's just a bit of the sort of underlying assumptions that I have. So on Venezuela, just out of curiosity, raise your hand if you feel really confident on Venezuela policy right now. Yeah, that's pretty standard. So I'm just going to do a really quick, I'm going to ignore so much important stuff, but just for the sake of time, a very quick just rundown of what happened, how we got here, where we are. But more importantly, we're going to dive into these probably 9 or 10 different sort of lessons that we can take from our policy towards Venezuela. It's always hard to figure out where to start. That's like the biggest challenge for policymakers. But basically, Venezuela was once a vibrant democracy. Over time, we saw it start to do what we very diplomatically call democratic backsliding. At first, this was under Hugo Chavez. A lot of that was because he was a charismatic leader. People were willing to follow him and sort of cede institutional authority over to him because of the power of his personality. When he died, he was succeeded by Nicolas Maduro, which is a name that you probably know. He's now associated with a Nike tracksuit, for those of you that saw his apprehension photos. He came into power without the charisma of Chavez, but with all of the ideology. And he wanted to make sure that he took over the key institutions so that he could remain in power long term. In 2018 was the first major election that we looked at where we said, we being the United States and the international community, there was a significant fraud committed here. The outcome of this election is illegitimate. Maduro didn't care about that. He decided to declare himself president despite the fact that there was no proof that he won the election. So he inaugurated himself in January of 2019, and that kicked off the start of the modern Venezuela crisis. The United States and about 60 other nations said there's no way democracy actually requires people to vote in a free and fair election. There's no other definition of that. So therefore, we are not going to recognize you. Moreover, we're going to take an article from the Venezuelan constitution that states in the absence of a presidency, we are going to pick essentially their Speaker of the House, their parliament, to be the interim president whose job is to hold free and fair elections going forward. This is where, for those of you who kind of hear a little bit about Venezuela, may have heard the name Juan Guaido. He was that position. He ended up being recognized by us and 60 other countries as the interim president of Venezuela. It kicked off a strategy of what we called maximum pressure, significant sanctions, asset freezes, et cetera, significant support to the people of Venezuela to try to help as they fought for democracy. And all of this was done with an eye towards getting Maduro to the table to negotiate a exit from power so that we could have free and fair elections. Unfortunately, despite many negotiation attempts, some that involved the United States, some that didn't, Maduro never actually made any changes to step down. During the same time period, we started to see two major shifts in the American domestic landscape. The first was an increase in illegal immigration, and the second was an increase in the drug crisis here in the United States, which was primarily driven by COVID-19. So what that ultimately meant was that the American public was much more attuned to the very type of instability that was being driven by the Maduro regime. This is why Venezuela became such a dominant topic during the campaign, because Venezuela was the cause of the largest mass migration in the history of the Western Hemisphere. So at this point, we're at almost 9 million Venezuelans have fled their country because of the human rights abuses. After all of this, and President Biden continued more or less a maximum pressure campaign, a few different key strategies, we could talk about that. But at the end of the day, Maduro still remained in power. In 2024, there was another presidential election in Venezuela. And this time, the opposition was incredibly capable. They all united, and they were able to put forward a single candidate. Not the original candidate that they picked, because the Maduro regime banned that person from running. Her name's Maria Corina Machado, but a sort of stand-in candidate for her. And not only that, they were able to prove that in these elections, the Maduro regime did not win. So they were able to collect basically the receipts from these elections. They're actually all stored at the Central Bank of Panama right now that show 70% of the people voted for Maria Corina Machado's candidate, which is Edmundo Gonzalez. So they were able to prove that the election was stolen by Maduro because he continued to say that he was elected president. He refused to step down. And then we got into the current situation, which is starting with this sort of drug boat diplomacy, which I'll talk a little bit more about, but ultimately ending on January 3rd with a team of special forces entering Venezuela on the ground and actually apprehending Maduro and his wife while they were in their fortress and bringing them to the United States to face justice. So that is more or less, there's a lot that's happened since then, but that's more or less what's relevant to kind of understand here. And the reason we had grabbed him is he was indicted on various charges, including narcotics trafficking, including weapons trafficking, conspiracy to traffic weapons and drugs as well. Okay, so what does this tell us? I think there's 10 sort of key lessons that we learn about at least President Trump's understanding of America's power in the world. The first is he did remind the world of U.S. military capability. I think we've seen this a couple of times through this administration. Whether you agree or disagree with the use of force in Midnight Hammer or Absolute Resolve, which was the Venezuela operation, at the end of the day, it's very difficult to say that it wasn't a remarkable success for our military. We were able to infiltrate a highly guarded fortress inside Venezuela. We did not experience any loss of human life or equipment. It was a few hours long, and we were able to achieve something that many administrations, to include President Trump's first administration, had completely failed to do. And that capability proof is a really important signal both to allies and adversaries about the power of the United States military. For a long time, we were seen alongside our allies as the military that stormed the beaches of Normandy. That was later replaced by scenes of our failure, whether it was Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, and now we're starting to see a shift in that. So, of course, there's other activities that have been going on, but I think that's one major benefit to this operation. The second is he reminded our allies and adversaries of U.S. will. And for those of you who are international relations students, you know that combination of capability and will is the cornerstone of deterrence. So in a sense, one could make the argument that this operation did help reestablish American deterrence. And that's really important, too, because there has been a narrative that Americans are not willing. All of these countries hear us complaining about endless wars. They think that we're not actually willing to defend ourselves, our principles, our values. And so this is something that I think is important as a communications message. The third thing that I think we learned from this is President Trump's unique understanding of what sovereignty means. In this instance, while he does spend a lot of time speaking about borders, it's important to realize that Venezuela is not actually on America's border. And in fact, most of the Venezuelans that were fleeing the Maduro regime were not coming to the United States. They were going to Ecuador, they were going to Brazil, they were going to Colombia, Peru, et cetera. Many of them did come to the United States, but it wasn't the root of the migration problem entering the United States. But President Trump's definition of sovereignty seems to be, and this is me assessing from what I've seen in both this theater and others, seems to be ensuring that America is free of military and economic coercion by our adversaries. This is why I think when you look at where he gets involved in Venezuela, he starts looking at immediately minerals, resources, Ukraine, mineral deal. People who study this know that these are important components because right now we are heavily dependent on our adversaries for a lot of the things that we need to make America work. We don't make the things that make the things we make, is a way of putting it. And so we need to make sure that we gain control over that. So a lot of what you hear President Trump talking about, even if it's something like Greenland, and again, not defending this because I'm very opposed to his language on Greenland, but it stems from this concept of having sovereignty so that we can make our own decisions without that economic or military coercion from anybody else. The fourth component of how I think President Trump is shaping policy is you will notice a significant difference between the first administration and the second administration as it relates to one very specific thing, and that is the role of human rights, democracy, and freedom in the rhetoric. Every once in a while, Trump will allude to this. In the Iran context, he did say that he would protect the protesters. He did say that he hoped that they, took control of their government. But in Venezuela, that was always the primary functioning motivation, was the fact that stability in the country is dependent on there being democracy. And in this case, he's really abandoned that language about freedom. I think there are implications to this. He's obviously trying to avoid the narrative that we're fighting wars of regime change because we're just focused on principles and we're not actually focused on, the core, hard American interest. But the negative consequence of that goes back to one of my primary assumptions, which is a lot of the countries that want to partner with the United States want to partner with us, not just because we're a very wealthy country, but because they know when they partner with us, they will be doing so as sort of tying into our values, tying into our goals. And they know that that's not the case as it relates to China. So that lack of rhetorical emphasis on freedom is a pretty significant shift where it is seen as actually a bad thing to talk about freedom as opposed to a good thing. The sixth thing that I think we learned from this is the limitations of international law. I am sure people are going to fight me on this point. I interpret President Trump's actions as exposing central failings of the international legal system as opposed to breaking that system in the first place. For the sake of time, I will sort of move through this quickly, but I will just say ultimately a big part of why we have these systems are to make sure that people are free from human rights abuses, from genocide, from all of these things. The UN has also determined that Maduro was committing crimes against humanity, and yet, notwithstanding all the diplomacy in the world, notwithstanding all of the international legal support, nobody was able to help protect the people of Venezuela, just as they were not able to help protect the people of Iran. What was able to do that was the American military power. And that demonstrates that we need to be much more thoughtful if we want to preserve these goals that international law has, which I think are very valuable goals. We need to rethink how we build those systems. The seventh component that we learned from the Venezuela context is the role of soft power. Here also I would have a criticism where we have spoken about the importance of kicking Russia, China, and Iran out of the hemisphere. We've actually done very little to do that. Delcy Rodriguez, who's now recognized by the United States as the president of Venezuela, despite being Maduro's second-hand woman, has a very close relationship with all three of those countries. The first thing she did when she was inaugurated was embrace the ambassadors of those three countries. And more importantly, they benefit hugely from Chinese technology, which enables their suppression. And the United States, unfortunately, when we canceled all of the programs we did within USAID, when we canceled a lot of the programs with this sort of soft power emphasis, we were also canceling programs that actually promoted U.S. Relationships. So things like ripping up Huawei Chinese infrastructure and putting in American and allied equipment. Those are all things that are really beneficial to American security that we now no longer have. So here it's really been a mixed bag, particularly the fact that we haven't been emphasizing the importance of soft power. The last few points, number 8 is the point of ideology. This is not a criticism exclusively of the Trump administration. This is a criticism of U.S. foreign policy since the dawn of time, which is to say, We do not understand the role that ideology plays in other countries' foreign policy. You saw this a lot when it came to Russia. I spoke to, I won't say who it was, I spoke to people who are sort of widely recognized as some of the top experts on Russia, who have only studied Russia exclusively for the past 20 or 30 years. 5 days before the invasion of Ukraine, I said, are they going to attack? It certainly looks like they're going to attack. No, they wouldn't attack. It's not in their interest. It is in their interest if you understand what their interest is, if you understand their ideology. And in the United States, though it feels that we are becoming increasingly ideological, we're not functionally an ideological country. And this is a mistake we make as it relates to dealing with many countries that are much more ideological. Whether it's Iranians, whether it's Cubans, whether it's Venezuelans, whether it's Palestinians, there are people who have ideals far above the ones of just hard, capitalist, et cetera. So that's one major flaw that we have, and that was why we weren't able to take out Maduro for quite some time. We did not understand how opposed Chavismo was to the United States. Number 9 is to do with processes. Many of you probably are aware that the Trump administration has shifted a lot of the processes that Henry was talking about. The National Security Council processes are no longer existing in the same way. We no longer have people in the room that are necessarily disagreeing with the president. I will freely admit there are certain people in this administration that, from a substantive perspective, am happy that they're not necessarily in the room making these decisions. But from a procedural perspective, absolutely you need people in the room who are going to disagree with you, who are going to make the strongest argument against it so that you can make the best decision going forward. And because we don't have those processes, we're seeing all this idiosyncratic behavior where sometimes it says, well, he said he cared about drugs, countering drugs, and he blew up all these boats, but at the same time, he's now pardoned the former president of Honduras who was indicted for drug trafficking. So what's the connection? There is no connection, right? I mean, that's not everything is grand strategy, and I think that's a core understanding that we need to bring to bear. Last one, because I have 55 seconds left. The last one is messaging, and this is also a criticism of all parties and all administrations, but it's increasingly gotten bad over the last few years, which is if you do decide to go into government, it is really important that you understand messaging is not the same thing as policy. Saying you support something is not the same thing as actually supporting it. We have become a hugely performative country. That's true not just for us individually, but it's true for our government as well. And we've seen many cases, the gunboat diplomacy is a great example of this. That was a great message for President Trump's base. We're getting rid of all the drugs. Those of you who understand drug policy, those weren't the drugs that we're worried about, and they weren't coming to the United States. So it was optics versus reality. Now, there's a point of that is necessary to a certain degree, but having that overwhelm the policy can oftentimes be at odds with your ultimate end goals. So with that, I will say, I'm not judging the specific net benefit or net loss to American power in the world, but I'm hoping that giving you these sort of top lines through the lens of Venezuela give you something sort of to think about in terms of how President Trump is shifting what America's power in the world looks like.
Good job.
Okay, our final speaker, Eric Draitser, is an independent political analyst and a longtime writer and contributor for the website CounterPunch, as well as several other outlets, where he focuses on geopolitics and international affairs. Eric's political work began with anti-war activism around the Iraq War in 2003. While teaching high school in New York City, Eric became involved in the Occupy Wall Street movement when it emerged in 2011. And during this time, he started the first of several podcasts and his independent media project, which has been ongoing ever since. Eric received his BA in art history from the University at California, Santa Barbara. He also holds an MFA in poetry from the New School and an MS in education from Brooklyn College.
Thank you to Alec, to Shalyn for inviting me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. I'm going to provide an analysis that may be a bit different from some of the subjects that have been covered before. Obviously, unlike some of our other esteemed guests here, I don't work in government. I don't have that background. My background is quite varied in the arts, in political work, in a different profession entirely these days. So, but this work that I've been doing in terms of talking about U.S. power from a critical perspective, this is something I've been doing for years, basically going back to at least 2010. So I wanted to entitle this presentation, U.S. Power in the Age of Multipolarity, and I put that word in quotes because if you have encountered it before, or if you know something about the way that word has worked its way through the lexicon in the last 15 years, it's a little bit of a mixed bag because it is something that the Russians and various other disinformation platforms have pushed for many years to talk about the idea of U.S. power declining. So multipolarity as a sort of catch-all term for America bad, okay? But at the same time, I do think it's a useful concept in understanding some of the ways in which the rest of the world sees U.S. power and sees some of the processes that have been ongoing. So of course, who doesn't love a quote, obviously, to start a PowerPoint presentation? You've probably seen this book or read this book before. Pretty famous quote, "Imperial overstretch leads to the erosion of a state's relative power, the rise and fall of great powers." Not a novel concept, but I think it's something worth thinking about as we think about U.S. power, how it has evolved over several decades. Now, of course, I'm going to be encapsulating a lot of history in a very short amount of time, from 100,000 feet or something like this, but at the very least, I'd like to at least provide a framework for understanding something like a critical perspective on how the United States has operated and how we have come to this point. U.S. power has undergone a significant transformation since the end of the Cold War. To use this terminology of unipolar versus multipolar, a unipolar global order with Washington and Wall Street at the center is, at least in theory, being replaced by a multipolar system where competing powers create alternative or parallel systems and institutions. Whether you think they're viable, whether you think they can actually compete with the United States, secondary question. The point is, these processes are happening. The multipolar order is a direct consequence of U.S. policy and its exercise of power in the post-Cold War period, as I'm going to show with several examples. Contrary to anti-U.S. and anti-Western propaganda, multipolarity does not imply a more peaceful or a more just world. Contrary to Western and U.S. propaganda, multipolarity is not anti-Americanism, but in my view, a response to U.S. dominance. What is U.S. power emerging from the Cold War? A unipolar global order with Washington and Wall Street at the center, as I've already said. I want to just touch on several buckets or categories, however you want to describe them. Of course, we could point to 100 others, but these are some examples, and I wanted to just focus on concrete examples of how the United States actually uses its power, because while there are high-minded concepts about freedoms and democracy and all of these things, the practical reality of how the United States actually operates and uses its power, I think, is important to really keep in the forefront of our thinking. From a finance perspective, from the financial system perspective, the US dollar is probably the most potent of all U.S. weapons, the global reserve currency as it has been since the end of World War II, and actually maybe even a little before that. The U.S. Treasury market, the safe haven for global investment. Investors from all over the world need the U.S. Treasury market. It provides a tremendous degree of leverage, globally speaking, for the United States. The U.S. Federal Reserve System, which sets U.S. monetary policy, but it has major impact on monetary policy all over the world. Another example of the way in which the United States is able to exert its power and its influence in the financial space. Institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, all of which established and to a large degree you could say dominated by, monopolized by, however you want to describe it, by the United States historically. The private banking system, of course, which is massive. The financial services sector. The SWIFT system for international debt settlement. This is how international commerce happens. The SWIFT system, of course, is established and to a large degree within the purview of the United States. It's one of the ways in which the U.S. has targeted Russia, has targeted Iran by freezing them out of the SWIFT system. There's many other examples of this, but part of the economic toolkit warfare toolkit that the United States has used, as employed after the invasion of Ukraine or in other examples as well. This is the reason they can do those things is for these and other factors. Technology is another. I think it's fairly self-explanatory. I won't spend too much time, but Silicon Valley and big tech. It was mentioned earlier in one of the presentations this morning about soft power and talking about science and research, U.S. corporations, U.S. universities, and other institutions that have long since been magnets for for some of the brightest minds in the world. Another example of how the United States has exercised its power. The global telecommunications infrastructure. Basically, the internet was built on American infrastructure through American companies, and this is one of the major issues that authoritarian countries like Russia or China or other countries are constantly struggling with. How do they both have access to internet but also not be controlled by the United States? Hard power, military, of course, NATO and the U.S. military. Dwight Eisenhower famously warns against the military-industrial complex in the 1950s. I do think that it is far too narrow to call it a military-industrial complex at this point in history. Call it a vast military-industrial technology, surveillance, intelligence complex, or whatever other terms you want to attach to it. But it is a vast, vast system. Integration with national and regional military forces, one of the ways in which the United States in recent decades has been able to exert its influence without having to put boots on the ground is by embedding with national militaries. We saw this all throughout West Africa, in Central Asia, in many places as well. Another example of the way in which the United States is able to exert power. Soft power examples such as cultural production. I think too often maybe not enough attention paid to this form of soft power, Hollywood and television, music. Anybody want to take a guess as to why the Iranians are able to produce such really nice Lego propaganda videos? It is because they are raised on Hollywood and television from the United States. Journalism, news, and information dissemination, again, the United States was able to basically have a central dominant position in that space as well, and new media as well, web-based, non-traditional, etc. Global humanitarian leadership, of course, another example of U.S. soft power, probably one of the more potent examples. Food, nutrition, health programs, literacy, education, transparency, free media, anti-corruption, women's rights. Try to boil it down into one sentence. A single unified global capitalist system with the United States at the center, a system largely operating according to principles, rules, and mechanisms established post-World War II and modified throughout the neoliberal period, if I had to put it into one sentence. So what erodes the US-centered unipolar world order? Well, I'll just give you a little bit of background. In the early 90s, I lived in Russia. My father was working there at the time. I have a little bit of a unique perspective on the early 90s in Russia and on what happened in the post-Cold War, the immediate years of the post-Cold War period through something like lived experience, although I wasn't an adult at the time. Post-Cold War neoliberal plunder of the former Soviet republics. I do call it plunder. If you haven't read Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, I would certainly recommend it. It goes into some of the processes that were ongoing at this time. Many others have written about it. I know that Jeffrey Sachs was involved, and now he's a tremendous critic of this period. In any case, the creation of the oligarchs. This is the period in which this happens. The process by which this happens is where US and European investors came into Russia. My father was one of them, working with such people, coming in to make tremendous amounts of money. And the way in which this was done was through the ownership of former Soviet state assets, the selling off piecemeal, oftentimes, a lot of corruption, a lot of murky dealings with former KGB and so forth. This process, this period of time is what creates the oligarchs, and it is the oligarch class in Russia from which Putin really emerges and for which Putin really depends on his power. Asset stripping, neoliberal shock doctrine economics, and the destruction of the social safety net. Poll after poll after poll throughout the last 15 years. I don't know, maybe it's different now since the invasion of Ukraine, but previous to that, Poll after poll of public opinion in Eastern Europe showed that although they did not have positive views of the Soviet Union and of the Soviet system and of communism and all of that, they had a positive view of the past because of their standard of living. And the decline in the standard of living and the stripping of the social safety net that existed previous to this period, that caused a tremendous degree of upheaval in these countries. And quite frankly, it is, I would argue, the primary reason why we have today a phenomenon called Soviet nostalgia. Soviet nostalgia is not really nostalgia of people of Eastern Europe for the Soviet Union. It is, to a large degree, a nostalgia for a time in the past when life was easier, when life was simpler. And I can tell you that as somebody who is a Russian speaker and who reads Russian news quite a lot, I can tell you that this is something that has been discussed for 30 years. The transformation of NATO into an offensive force. NATO, of course, a defensive alliance throughout the post-war period. What is the purpose of NATO once the Cold War is over? I would argue it is transformed into an offensive force, as we saw in the use of force against Serbia in the conflict in the Balkans. I would also argue that it has, to a large degree, ignited some of the ideas that Putin has in Eastern Europe, including the expansion into the former Soviet states, the Baltics. Now, whether you agree with this apocryphal story that there were promises made that the United States would not expand NATO eastward, whether you believe that or not, doesn't, in my opinion, matter. The Russians do see it this way. The next decade, 9/11 and the global war on terror, the transformation of the U.S. military posture, the idea of global offensive operations. It is in the very branding of the concept global war on terror. The global war on terror is in many ways, in my view, at least partially a transformative period. We have the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan under various pretexts. It began with a fight against al-Qaeda. Then we were somehow interested in protecting Afghan schoolgirls. Then there was a question about spreading democracy and so forth. The institutional rejection of international law. There were comments about international law that I found quite interesting. I would also argue, though, that we have had actually something of a continuity, though it has accelerated over this period. This is the beginning, I would argue, of institutional rejection of international law. The very first political protest I ever was part of in Washington was against these torture and rendition programs that the Bush administration was carrying out at the time. Of course, plenty of reporting on CIA black sites and other things that were happening then. And Abu Ghraib in Iraq is another example of this. The Iraq War, which was transformative for people of my age group, for people who were in college at that time, who were first becoming exposed to politics and to understanding what the U.S. was and what U.S. power was. The Iraq War was a blatantly illegal war based on absolute lies. We knew they were lies at the time. Many people argued that point. History has proven that to be true. Undermined global confidence in the United States. It undermined confidence in the United States as a defender of democracy, as the leader of the free world. It undermined confidence in the mainstream media, in the press, in the idea that they're reporting facts and that we can decide based on those facts. We all remember, where are the WMDs? And I would argue this war normalized the blueprint for future criminal wars, which is precisely what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. The Obama period, U.S. power gets a makeover. Obama, of course, gets a Nobel Peace Prize. The idea of a pivot to Asia. I would argue that the pivot to Asia is really more about rearranging pieces on the chessboard than it is about a fundamental transformation of U.S. Policy and the U.S. conception of its power globally. This is the beginning of the period of drone warfare. I would argue, again, this is important, these were all illegal according to international law, which, again, whether you think that that's important in this country, around the world, people think that's pretty important. Illegal strikes, Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, a number of other countries I'm not going to list here. This is also the period in which responsibility to protect doctrine becomes a central idea among many within the policy world and so forth. Samantha Power, of course, famously wrote the book on the subject before she became the ambassador at the United Nations. This is the doctrine precisely that comes out of the failure of the U.S. to intervene in the genocide in Rwanda, and then it is applied here as, I think, the most egregious example in Libya, where the United States and NATO used the pretext of protecting civilians from the Gaddafi regime in order to destroy the country and ultimately plunge it into a civil war that it really hasn't emerged from, and that was 14 years ago. Small-scale wars, smaller-scale wars as opposed to large mobilization wars and regime change and nation building. We have I would argue, a slight difference in tactics, not necessarily a difference in ideology. The U.S. is beginning to feel the blowback of these policies at this time. Of course, Chalmers Johnson famously wrote the book Blowback, talking about how 9/11 represented the blowback of U.S. policy throughout the 1980s and the 1990s. Here we have, I think, maybe a more contemporary form of that, the development of the Islamic State, ISIS, in the Middle East, North Africa, in the Sahel. This is a direct outgrowth of some of these policies, I would argue. Ukraine in 2014, the seizure of Crimea, also represents an example of blowback, and I'm going to explain how. 2016 to present, I know I'm sort of putting the Biden administration and the Trump administration together, and I recognize that they're different, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of focus here. Trump is an avatar for a hyper-aggressive, erratic, and an unpredictable form of U.S. power. Venezuela, Iran, Greenland, et cetera. We could point to many examples. I would argue that the Trump administration has simply dropped the pretext of international law to the extent that the United States paid lip service to it throughout the Bush administration and the Obama administration. I believe that Trump doesn't see it that way, and frankly, I don't believe that there even is international law at this point. Trump as a natural evolution of U.S. power. I think this is a critical point that I wanted to just mention. I think it's liberal fantasy, in my view, liberal fantasy to see Trump as some kind of an aberration, to see Trump as a strike from the blue, or however you want to describe it. In some ways, I would say he is part of an evolution of this process. The unitary executive theory, I'm not going to spend time on that, but I think Trump is a good example, the epitome of the unitary executive theory taken to its logical extreme. To summarize that point, Bill Barr is, of course, one of the people, the former Attorney General, one of the people who's an outspoken advocate of this theory. Dick Cheney was as well. The idea that the president is basically the CEO of the executive branch and he can do whatever he wants, right? This is essentially the concept. Obviously, there's more legalistic stuff involved in that, but I'm not going to get into it. Trump as a representative of the most reactionary elements of the ruling class, whether you want to talk about that in the form of industries, dirty, polluting industries, whether you want to talk about it in the form of social policies and so forth, Trump is a representative of these reactionary elements. But at the same time, he's also a representative of a reaction to what had historically been a neoliberal consensus, at least since the 1970s. So what sort of multipolarity emerges? I would describe it as a global system of competing local and regional powers, vying for influence and profits, both in collaboration and conflict with each other at times, depending on circumstances, and irrespective of nominal alliances or rivalries. I could point to 100 examples of non-Western countries that at times are working together, at times are competing with each other. This is part of the complexity of what we're seeing, this emerging multipolarity. I would break it down, of course, using my own preferences and language. I would break it down into two broad categories: the creation of parallel institutions and the execution of parallel crimes. Focusing on those same categories that I talked about previously when describing U.S. power, financial power. You have, as I mentioned, the financial architecture globally that the United States has been able to control for decades. You're beginning to see the emergence of new institutions. Now, whether you think these are actually able to compete or whether you think they're just kind of window dressing, that's a matter of debate. I would argue, though, that these are irreversible processes that have been set into motion. The BRICS Development Bank, BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That acronym, by the way, is a creation of Goldman Sachs. It doesn't really have a political currency, but these countries have begun to use it as sort of a catch-all term to describe non-Western deal-making alliances and so forth. Chinese financing the Belt and Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road, or the various other ways that they've branded this idea. This is not just China building infrastructure around the world. This is China exporting its capital. This is China flexing financial muscle in ways that the United States simply either can't, won't, doesn't want to, et cetera. Building massive infrastructure projects. I think it's important to note here that these are not necessarily always beneficial, certainly not always beneficial to the local populations. They are oftentimes environmentally devastating. Oftentimes they employ either imported Chinese labor or local labor at slave wages and so forth. So I'm not suggesting that these are necessarily all wonderful. I'm just pointing to the fact that there are these countervailing forces that are now coming to bear on U.S. power. The BRICS Pay system is now developed as an alternative to this SWIFT system. Will BRICS Pay allow Russia and China to settle their debts without ever having to touch a U.S. financial institution? That's certainly the idea, because right now, basically all commercial business flows in some way through U.S. banks. It's what provides the U.S. that tremendous leverage to not only use sanctions, but use the threat of secondary sanctions. If you are an entity that has some connection to some bank that has a connection to a U.S. bank, you could be targeted. It's one of the principal ways that they are looking to get away from that U.S.-dominated system. The crypto market, if you follow the Iranian toll booth story in the Hormuz recently, you know that the Iranians had allegedly been charging tolls on these tankers, and they were collecting their tolls in crypto. I don't think I need to explain further why that's important and why something like that would not have been possible 5-10 years ago. Science and technology, Chinese advances in research, AI, robotics, and energy production. Chinese researchers now producing cutting-edge research. I forget who was mentioning it in the previous panel, but the idea of the best and the brightest always coming to the United States for education and then going back to China, that seems to have now reversed. You now see them staying in China, going to Chinese institutions, working in Chinese companies or for the Chinese government and so forth. So the United States is losing some of that leverage in terms of the way in which science and technology development proceeds. From the military perspective, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, this is established 15 years ago or so. Without getting into all of the specifics of all of the various things that it touches, the SCO more or less should be understood as a quasi-military partnership alliance between Russia and China. I wouldn't call it a formal alliance in that way exactly, but it's headed in that direction. Certainly since 2022, that has been at the top of the priority list. We have newly assertive countries. I think that it's something that most people don't realize. I think it was Henry was talking about Turkey earlier. I think most people don't understand or don't realize that Turkey is the #2 country in terms of overseas military installations in the world. 165 overseas military installations for the Turks, mostly in the Middle East, North Africa, and East Africa. That's a NATO country. I think that raises some pretty interesting questions about how the United States is operating, other countries, how they are operating. Newly assertive countries, Russia with its war in Ukraine, its footprint throughout Africa and beyond. Russia is more or less the caretaker for at least 4 governments in West Africa. They are involved in a lot of dirty, dirty work in Africa and elsewhere. The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all actively engaged in conflicts throughout Africa and the Middle East. Military technology and research catching up to the United States. Cultural production. I know I'm coming up on the time, so let me just move quickly. The U.S. establishes the blueprint for other countries seeking to exert their influence and/or regional hegemony. Now I want to focus on the example. Vice President Dick Cheney, Iraq is busy enhancing its capabilities in the fields of chemical and biological agents. They continue to pursue an aggressive nuclear weapons program, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens peace with weapons of mass murder. 2003. Do you think that these words are coincidental, or do you think these are carefully constructed words that are meant to signal something? If Ukraine acquires weapons of mass destruction, the situation in the world and in Europe will drastically change. We cannot but react to this real danger, all the more since, let me repeat, Ukraine's Western patrons may help it acquire these weapons to create yet another threat. We believe them, we heard them. They have wide nuclear competency from Soviet times, uranium enrichment, and then, of course, the classic, it's only a matter of time. It mirrors the blueprint for the US war in Iraq. There's my piece that, ignore the date because that was a reprint. This was written about 2 weeks after the invasion of Ukraine. We have the parallel justifications. They are obvious. They stare you in the face. Iraq, weapons of mass destruction. Ukraine, biological and nuclear weapons. Responsibility to protect Afghans, Iraqis, Libyans. Responsibility to protect Russian speakers of East Ukraine. Iran and Al-Qaeda, existential threat. Ukraine and the neo-Nazis of the Azov Battalion, an existential threat. Blackwater and the rise of the US military contractor Wagner and the rise of Russia's mercenary army. Again, as is often the case, Russians pursuing cheap knockoffs. War in Iraq, the development of the Islamic State, let's not mention 1 million dead, according to the UN. The war in Libya leads directly to a destabilization of the Sahel, as I mentioned. Turkey, Qatar, the Arab Emirates, Egypt, Russia, etc., scrambling for influence and control. Terrorist groups have expanded their footprint in the region. Russia expands its footprint in the region. Russia's stealing the gold in Mali. They're stealing gold in Sudan. They're involved in all sorts of conflicts that didn't exist prior to this period. Economic war, the development of non-Western financial systems, information and propaganda dominance leads directly to non-Western information and propaganda. You have state-backed media, RT, the Turkish TRT, CCTV. They reach wider audiences, and there is also an alternative ecosystem. You ever go on Telegram? There are thousands of Telegram channels dedicated to the idea of multipolarity, dedicated to the idea that the United States is declining, that its power is weakening. This is a non-mainstream media ecosystem that is penetrated deeply by other actors around the world. And the United States, I think, is a little confused as to how to deal with that. And that's what I got.
Thank you, Eric. And we now have time for questions. And I know our panelists would especially love to see questions from students, both undergraduate and graduate. So raise those hands. Chris, we'll go with Chris first.
I'll have a question for Ludovic and Henry. So I know that y'all are like foreign service officers and have had a deep diplomatic experience across many regions. So there's like ongoing efforts to kind of like re-examine the education or at least some of the onboarding that diplomats have under the Rubio State Department. So like going on your like historical experience, like what would you recommend being put in that list? Like what authors or diplomats should kind of guide American thinking and state practice?
So in my career at State, one of the projects I worked on was to develop a website on diplomatic tradecraft. So I would direct people to that website. I don't get paid, but no. Seriously, I think there is no handbook for diplomatic tradecraft. There are a lot of books about grand strategy, a lot of examples of really amazing things being done through crisis and crisis management. Not a lot of information to guide people exactly on this path through the Foreign Service. So what I did was talk to 150 or so ambassadors to try and get their practical ideas about how an officer, not negotiating with the Russians, but how about when they're issuing a visa in Monterrey, Mexico? What do they think? How do they use those experiences to build their career? So at 20 years in, which is roughly when someone will actually ask you your opinion, is that you're ready and prepared, and you've done the things to get to the point where you can have an opinion. Of course, I'm not saying you're not in the conversation, but roughly you're deputy ambassador or DAS or director of an office or something at around 20 years. So it's that what do you do in that 20 years to develop the tools so that you are able to have a voice, able to manage your relations with the press or other diplomats or in the interagency. So a lot of different ways you can do that, and I'm happy to talk to you further about that, happy to direct you to this site. But as far as specifically on the training, I think that there has been an over-politicization of the bureaucrats. I think the deep state is a myth. I think that vast majority of foreign service officers, civil service officials are looking for guidance, and they're seeking a chance to try and implement the policies. So I think that there has been a politicization of the down into the mid-level and junior level diplomats, and I think it is changing criteria towards having loyalty be one of the criteria instead of excellence or tradecraft or ability to implement policy. So that's a few thoughts about tradecraft. I don't know, Ludo, if you want.
Let's go to another question.
Yeah.
I have a question primarily directed to Mr. Hood, Ludovic. You said that you and some of your colleagues worked on Obama's nuclear agreement with Iran, and I was hoping you could comment on the kind of integrity of that agreement in the days, leading up to the military buildup in the Strait from the U.S. and then the strikes.
The 2014 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the so-called Iran nuclear deal, that ceased to be relevant when Trump pulled out of it in his first administration. He believed and listened to advisors who believed that Iran, A, was cheating on the deal, B, that the sunset provisions, the multi-year limits for certain activities were too short term. And I think for some of us, more importantly, the deal didn't have any restrictions on Iran's ballistic missile program, its long-range ballistic missile development program, and perhaps more importantly on what it was doing in the region. And if anything, I think qualitatively one can say that in the years following the inking of that deal, Iran, as I noted before, was doing more and more destabilizing activity in the region. Certainly, it made most of its Arab allies very upset, not to mention the Israelis. So the Trump administration, has been talking to the Iranians on and off, actually, even more than the Biden people were over the last 15 months to see what's possible with the deal. And based on today's headlines alone, it feels like something's in the air. It feels like there's some kind of, typically Trumpian out-of-the-box deal brewing. And for some reason, even the New York Times front page today, for the first time in 6 weeks, actually has a positive-ish headline about what's happening in the region vis-a-vis the U.S. role.
Thank you.
I think it's pretty safe to say that you can consider Trump as a great disruptor to the American political, diplomatic, foreign policy, military system. He's very unpredictable. You don't know what he's going to do 1 minute to the next. You guys have all touched on that throughout your talks. How much of this is Trump himself, his inner circle, or is it the mechanisms of more lower level officials within the government that might not necessarily get as much airtime on the news? What's basically directing this mostly?
Yeah, I mean, just again, this is just from my observation. I think there's a different answer to your question if you're talking about Trump 1 or Trump 2.
Okay.
And I would say in Trump 1, part of why it maybe felt like there was, even if you disagreed with some things that were done, more of a kind of thread, was because the bureaucratic system was still in place. And the bureaucratic system is, as with most things, it's nuanced. There is a reason why we have repetition in the system, because you're dealing with such important decisions that can fundamentally affect the lives of many people. You want to make sure that you're not, accidentally clicking the wrong button, right? So it is really useful to have that. At the same time, it can be really destructive. I once had a memo, something called an informational memo, which is basically just giving data points to the Secretary of State. You're not asking him to do anything. You're literally just saying, here's a thing that happened. And you have to get it cleared by the entire State Department. It took me 10 months to get this memo up. By the time it went up, it was totally out of date. I just wanted to get it through the freaking system, just to see if I could do it, like an individual challenge. So there are real problems. So I'm not saying that all of the destruction of bureaucracy is a problem, but what it does lead to is the answer to your question, which is this time around, I think the reason it feels more idiosyncratic is because it is largely President Trump. Not only has he gotten rid of the bureaucratic layers, but also the people who are at the top levels are much more willing to say yes. So just a very quick example, in the first Trump administration, he also wanted to send an armada to the coast of Venezuela. And he asked the Secretary of Defense, who, I mean, we had like 15 Secretaries of Defense that time. I forget who it was. I think it might have been Esper. I'm not sure. They asked him, do you want to, can we do this? No, we can't do it. There, you know, all these ships are predetermined where they're going to be, blah, blah, blah. We can't do it, but we'll send a hospital ship. So that we sent like a hospital ship, and everybody was like, why is this here? And it was there because he wanted to send a Navy boat, and that was the only thing that the Navy was willing to send. So fine, fast forward to today, same situation. I want an armada on the coast of Venezuela. You got it. That's what we get. So I do think now part of what we're seeing is just him, and doesn't mean his advisors aren't jumping in, but it's definitely much more responsive to him. Whether or not that holds in a next administration from a future president is really the question of like how much bureaucracy do we bring back or not.
I would just very, very quickly, I would agree that there's a huge difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2. Trump 1, for whatever reasons, he inherited the National Security Council system. He kept it largely intact. The IPCs, this assistant secretary level function, they met on numerous topics weekly, then to the deputies, then to the principals. I mean, all of that has been blown out of the water in Trump. It's a very top-down approach. Now, look, the disruption, I believe, was necessary. I'd love to hear Professor Preston talk more about the growth of the national security bureaucracies after 9/11. It's out of control in Washington, and there is need for serious disruption and a serious need for streamlining processes. What Carrie described in the 10-month memo is so common, even on life and death issues. And the processes I saw in the Syria civil war, I mean, we talked our way through a slow motion genocide and did nothing about it. It still kills me to this day. But it was just process. Trump is doing a lot of things on his own, and he's really keeping his own counsel. I think most people in his inner circle were opposed to attacking Iran 6 weeks ago. Trump did it anyway. Ironically, I think Bolton tried really hard 7 years ago to get him to attack Iran, and he just didn't like John Bolton, so he didn't, Anyway, so there's all kinds of stuff there. There's all kinds of ironies, but here we are.
Thank you.
Brogan?
My question's for Henry. You talked about kind of relations with Korea, and over the past couple of years, Korea's been a major exporter of different weapon systems, the K2PL and their version of the HIMARS system. I was wondering how that might affect, say, U.S. relations with Korea, and maybe getting more into kind of the foreign arms markets, and how the U.S. might be responding to essentially increasing Korean presence, South Korean presence on these markets.
It's a great question. The last President Yoon, who was impeached, but his goal was to get Korea from, I think they're the 7th largest exporter of defense equipment. His goal was to get to 4th. It's not unlikely. I imagine the current president has a similarly ambitious goal. It's probably pretty realistic because of their ability to produce the weapon systems you talk about, plane trainers and kind of everything. The good thing is that when the U.S. went expensive and high-tech, Korea went high-tech but less expensive. And so it's quite complementary in what they offer. And what they offer is equipment that's useful in Poland, in the Baltics, in Ukraine, for deterring, the artillery to deter the Russians and otherwise. So I think there's a big market. Their interceptors of drones and other missile systems, also good and cheaper and perhaps complementary to the U.S. system. So I think there is whether we like it or not, we, the United States defense industry, it is the Korean defense industry is here to stay. And I think we'll see the growth from this. This was during the Moon presidency. It went from, just to give you an idea, it went from $2 billion export a year in, 19 or 20, up to $20 billion a few years later. So it was a tenfold increase, I think over 4 or 5 years, the time when I was there. This will continue. Again, mostly complementary. I think now we have an addition of the shipbuilding industry, which will perhaps allow Koreans to get into the naval shipbuilding business. They're in the maintenance business already with us. I think I don't think, Hanwha, Hyundai, LIG, several of the largest defense companies are trying to become, their goal is to become US primes. Hanwha USA, LIG Next One USA, to become US primes. However, I think that's a bit further afield. I think what they will succeed and continue to succeed with is selling, and they also offer co-production. They're much less they don't monetize as much as our industry does as far as after service. So I think these are all very attractive to lots of countries, and I think we'll see just a continued growth. And I think that if the U.S. is smart, they'll support that because it's largely complementary. And they can sell to countries that might not buy U.S. systems.
Over here.
Okay. 3 points. Most generally, the military as a means to improve human rights. I'm going to allude to America's history. We have had, of course, a serious problem with human rights regarding slavery, civil rights, or, treatment of Native Americans. I don't want to harp on that too much because that's not my theme, but the point is I can't think of a worse way for Americans to have tried to work out and improve those problems than to have major foreign powers involved militarily against us, trying to enforce some kind of human rights back in those days, assuming that we overcome those. In a way, Mr. Draitser's presentation is a critique of Mr. Hood's Professor Hood's, Dr. Hood's presentation from the point of view of human rights. So we can kind of let that stand. I would make the small point that the Gulf states were not completely innocent bystanders. They were involved in destabilizing Syria and Yemen, and that played a role in the large number of civilian casualties in those countries. So they weren't completely innocent contributing to the chaos. The general point about policy on the Middle East for the last 35 years or so, and I say this as a historian who does more distant history more in the past. It's hard for me, the human rights critique has already been made by Mr. Draitser, but just from the point of view of stability, it seems to me in general that the policy has been to maximize chaos. We're not admitting that that's what we're doing, but clean break strategy, there are allusions to that as a strategy. And I would say that as a historian, that is the wrong long-term approach to the region. Generally, not in all cases, but generally better to work with existing states rather than to stir up sectarian and other in Eastern Europe, ethnic conflicts that lead to state collapse and enormous problems with casualties and human rights problems for ordinary people.
Thank you. We have a lot of other questions, though, so would you mind?
Okay,
Like
and
real
just
questions?
about Ukraine, Russia versus Iraq, the U.S. Not the same at all. Nuclear missiles on Ukraine's borders, parts of them 2 minutes to Moscow. Not the same as the alleged missiles from either Iran or Iraq to even Israel, but it's certainly not the United States. Russia has a point that now that we've withdrawn from all nuclear arms control agreements with Russia, just saying we refuse to discuss the issue of what kind of military infrastructure, including nuclear infrastructure, on the Ukrainian border with Russia, that is a danger to the entire world, and constantly passing the buck about that issue and pretending that there is no valid point there. We would not for one instant allow China or Russia to put nuclear missiles on the Canadian or Mexican border.
Okay.
That needs to be addressed. For
Do you
the
have a
safety-
question?
I think
Point of
respectfully,
clarification.
there's a lot of students here, and I'm really interested in hearing what their questions are. So
That's
really
why we came here,
appreciate-
yeah.
We really appreciate your thoughts, but I think we should turn to more
John, I
questions.
think I saw you had a question.
Yes, my question was primarily for Eric, and I was curious when you brought up the issue of sort of a degrading of the system of international law, specifically in the context of the Iraq War, and I was curious to hear, A, whether you saw any prospects for any system of international law to be rebuilt, and B, what events post-Iraq War have in a similar way contributed to its decline, its fracturing, etc.
Well, I'm not an international law scholar, so I'm not going to get into the nuances of that. I would leave that to experts on that. I think that the record of the last 30 years and maybe longer has shown that the United States has, to some degree, abdicated the position that it once had as the so-called leader of the free world. We have seen countless examples since Iraq of violations of basic norms of international law. I think the entire concept of the drone program that Obama implemented was a blatant violation of international law, one that in a large degree undermined U.S. standing internationally, because as you remember, Obama was given a Peace Prize when he came into office. Obama was, at least in theory, supposed to represent some transformation within the U.S. policy, but instead, much of the world saw continuity in that policy. So I would argue that international law, while it does exist, I would suggest needs to return to the basics of the Nuremberg Principles. The Nuremberg Principles, which form the foundation of international law, including the very basic principle above all others that the crime against peace, the making of aggressive war, is the ultimate and supreme crime. That to me is the underlying issue.
Right here.
I have a question for Miss Filipetti. I hope we're not
No, that's
butchering
perfect.
that. You talked about how we've become, talked about a little bit about how we've become a very performative country when it comes to politics and like politicians, especially with the last election. What do you think have been like the biggest performative actions or empty promises made from either presidential candidates or politicians, separate from that? And do you think down the line they will ever like, I don't know if pay is the right word, but like if that will come back to slap them in the face for making those empty promises?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the history of American politics is one of empty promises, and I think it's been made worse. I mentioned that I hate social media. I think social media is a big reason for this. You know, and again, here there's like sort of trade-offs, right? So transparency is really important in U.S. policy. Transparency has also had a negative side effect, which is you put cameras into these hearing rooms and then people perform for the cameras as opposed to really trying to get to the bottom of the discussion in the hearing. So you have, you know, people like Matt Gaetz when he was a member of Congress saying, I want to put cameras everywhere. And it's like, right, but is that for transparency or because you want to be able to put a short clip on social media and then promote it and then, you know, promote yourself? I think a big problem with it is that the people who should be running for office are people who understand what a dirty business it is, and they don't want any part of it because they're virtuous, civically minded people, and they just don't want to throw their whole life into this mix. They don't want these people to be their colleagues. And I think that's one of the central problems is that the people who are incentivized to try to come to these positions are not incentivized necessarily because they want to do the right thing, but increasingly because of all the attention on them, because they want the most attention. In terms of specific promises, I actually think one of the major, this is maybe not so much, everybody says that they're going to improve the lives of everyday Americans. Obviously, that's something that not a president doesn't have exclusive control over that, right? Anything can happen during their term. You know, people who say they were presidents during times of peace, it's not entirely because of them often, although sometimes it is. But you look at some of the central problems that our country is facing, things that we know are going to come to a head. Our national debt, first and foremost. Yeah. People don't even talk about our national debt anymore when they're running, because what are they going to say that's going to get them elected? Nothing. There were only 2 candidates in the last election in the primaries that spoke about the national debt, Nikki Haley and Chris Christie. Neither one of them fared particularly well in the primaries, because there are things that politicians need to be willing to do in order to better serve the people. That's not what we necessarily want to hear. And so I think the biggest issue is just the everyday lives of Americans. And one of my concerns is that what President Trump represents is what you could call right-wing populism, right? So there's left-wing populism, there's right-wing populism. What we see in Latin America over the last couple of election cycles is a rapid shift. Everybody who was elected was a left-wing populist. And then the very next election, everyone that was elected was the other, what did I say, right-wing? First it was left-wing, then it was right-wing, then it was left-wing. And the problem is what ends up happening is people start making a compromise internally, and they say, well, hold on, I just want, to Eric's point of like the security concept, I just want security. I don't need this, the freedom part. I just want to have a safe life. And then they start compromising on the institutions that preserve our democracy. That is happening in Latin America. There is a risk that if we keep having both political parties fail to live up to what they promise, that will begin to happen also in the United States. And we'll see that sort of left-wing, right-wing, left-wing, right-wing, nobody's actually solving the problem. Finally, somebody comes to power and says, I'll fix it for you, just trust me, hold on, we don't actually need this institution, we don't need this, we don't need that. That's how democracies end up in decline. It's partially what happened in Venezuela, although not exactly. So that's the thing that I most worry about is there's a lot of understanding that politicians need to run on domestic issues, but what are the issues that generate the most amount of attention are the ones that are much sort of broader.
We have time for 1 or 2 more, so come right here.
Hi, this is for Ms. Filipetti. I am a biology student. I'm not into political science at all.
I was a religious studies major, so you could always do it.
So I'm a little bit naive when it comes to learning about these things. I'm here to learn. So it was mentioned that you not only have experience in foreign policy in Venezuela, but also in Cuba.
Yeah.
And what things have we learned about foreign policy from the U.S.'s relations with Cuba? And what are the similarities and differences between foreign policy in Venezuela and Cuba?
You're trying to get me into trouble because there's a camera. Can I just tell you, so when I first became the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cuba and Venezuela, the very first piece of advice I got from everybody was, don't become the Cuba person. Just only talk about Venezuela, don't become the Cuba person. I think that actually kind of answers your question, which is to say our Cuba policy, now I serve the Trump administration, so I am a conservative, I'm a Republican. I believe in I generally tend to agree with the idea of using pressure to force regimes because I feel like regimes are overly ideological and sometimes they're not responsive to just diplomacy. That being said, I think what we've seen in the Cuba context, and we see it in other contexts, but Cuba especially, is it has become such a political issue that it is very hard to approach it exclusively from a policy lens. There is no middle ground situation. It's either we're warming our relations with the Cuban regime, as was tried under the Obama administration, or it's we're doing a total isolation, as was attempted under the Trump administration. What I think needs to be done is more of a focus on, you always hear maximum pressure. I think we need to make sure that we understand when we talk about maximum pressure for the regime, the only way that really helps is if we also have maximum support for the people. And in the Cuba context, it's really challenging to get that support to the people. But ultimately, I think what we weren't doing enough of is that nuanced policy of saying, okay, here's how we pressure the regime and simultaneously help make sure that there's dollars going into the hands of everyday Cubans. The one thing that we did I was proud of a lot of things I shouldn't frame it that way, a lot of the things that we did in the Trump administration, but one thing I was particularly proud of in the Cuba context was something called the prohibited accommodations list. So people often say that our administration was just being restrictive, we were isolating the island. But one of the things that actually our civil servants came up with was they understood that the mandate was we want to be tougher on the Cuban regime. But they also understood that if we want to see a rise in protests, if we want to see the creation of political parties, then we need to make sure that there starts to be some semblance of if not a middle class, it doesn't even have to be a middle class, but some ability for everyday Cubans to have economic resources. And the prohibited accommodations list did not say nobody in Cuba you can't go to Cuba and stay in any hotel in Cuba. What it said was, if you go to Cuba, you have to stay in basically their version of Airbnb. It has to be run by a Cuban person who is not associated with the regime. The idea being try to infuse dollars into the hands of the Cuban people. Those are the types of policies that I think are important for us to consider. It's not the be-all, end-all, but something like that where we're actually providing some access to the Cuban people. We've seen significant changes in Cuba over the last couple of years. We've seen protest movements that have taken on populations that previously were not protesting the regime. So there's a lot of possible grassroots support there, and obviously some significant human rights abuses on the island, including people today who are sort of on their deathbed because of hunger strikes in Cuban prisons. But I think it needs to get outside of the political space and get much more focused on the sort of policy aspect of it.
Okay, we are at 5 o'clock, so I think I will end it there, but please join me in thanking.
Thanks, guys.